Welcome to my Bob Thurman podcast. I'm so grateful some good friends enabled me to present them to you. If you enjoy them and find them useful, please think of becoming a member of Tibet House US to help preserve Tibetan culture. Tibet House is the Dalai Lama's cultural center in America. All best wishes. Have a great day.
This is episode 255, Lucid Living, Dying, and Dreaming with Andrew Holecek.
I have a question for you, actually.
Yeah, sure.
Was it you who said that you had experienced meditating where you were consciously unconscious or unconsciously conscious?
You mean
in
like,
other words, that would you once told me that, didn't you, when we first were communicating?
yeah.
So can you unpack that a little more? I really like that. You see, I have a theory that enlightenment is, everybody wants enlightenment to be something simple. So they want, for example, we like to sleep. And when we sleep, we don't worry about a thing. Unless in a dream we might, but otherwise when we're sound asleep, we don't worry about a thing, deep sleep.
Yeah.
And then we wake up, and then that's all the same thing we're always in our sense field. So they want enlightenment also to be some simplistic state. Whereas I think it has to be a kind of embrace of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Without having to hop even back and forth, a simultaneous embrace of opposite things.
Absolutely.
But then that's just a theory again. That's just a description. But it's being so open that you can see both sides of something. So, of course, an ultimate experience of that is to be conscious of experiencing yourself as unconscious.
Yes.
Can you unpack that more for us?
Well, I can try a little bit if we're talking about the same thing. So yeah, I mean both in terms of daytime formless meditations and also the sleep yoga. Because being consciously unconscious is another way to talk about this, is kind of a super consciousness. So it's not the blacking out, and this is actually a very subtle distinction when one falls into deep dreamless sleep. There are gradations of this deep dreamless sleep, as there is in fact with death. On one level, when you fall into deep dreamless sleep, it's not necessarily tunchik. It's not necessarily the same as the clear light mind. If you're falling into the alaya vijnana, that can just be kind of a foggy blackout. But when you descend into the ineffable, literally ineffable matrix of the clear light mind, that's the superconscious mind. That actually subsends even the alaya vijnana. And so, again, this is the dharmata. This is where we go and we die. This is turiya in Hindu Shaiva Tantra language. And this is in certain ways, and again, this is also very interesting because there's a very subtle tendency here, Bob, to become somewhat reductionistic, thinking that somehow turiya, dharmakaya, dharmata is it. Well, it's partly it, and it's a third of it, you could say. And so what happens very often then is we, as spiritual practitioners, we then had the unfortunate tendency to throw all eggs into that basket. And then from that position, instead of transcending and including form, we transcend and exclude form. And so I think this is super important, because this is where all the elitist, what Evan Thompson writes about, Buddhist exceptionalism, spiritual bypassing, all these subtle spiritual traps, where, like you said at the outset, and this cannot be overstated, that your awakening is incomplete if it's disembodied. Kaya is there for a reason. The word kaya is there for a reason. And so that may be part of it, but it's not it. Because if you don't suffuse your formlessness with form, then you just become a god, or you get stuck in some kind of stained Pure Land, so to speak. So I'm not sure that's exactly what you're talking or asking about, but I think it's a really important point.
Well, I'm just thinking about when you lose consciousness, and when Buddha taught what he called the four formless realms or the four immaterial realms, even though Buddhist scientists insist that there's a subtle physical in them, but there's no sense of there being a physical in them. And the first of those realms is the realm of infinite space. And the second one is the realm of infinite consciousness. And the third one is the realm of nothing whatsoever. And then the fourth one is the realm of neither conscious nor unconscious. And supposedly one can attain those states as a yogi. And actually, you don't have to be a Buddhist to do it. It's not a matter of Buddhist exceptionalism. I don't know, you told me about Evan. Evan is a former student of mine, but he
Yes,
never really,
he told me that.
he didn't really study that much with me. He just got started, and then he went off on his own.
Right.
And he got into being a philosopher, and then the guild of himself as a philosopher doesn't allow for other kinds of exceptionalism because they're exclusively involved in philosophical exceptionalism.
That's exactly right.
And they want that to be, of course, hard as the materialist scientist exceptionalism, which is the ultimate exceptionalism of the academy nowadays. That's the high priest. Those are the high priests of the academy. And the philosophers are desperate not to just be thought of as some sort of logicians who you go there to the philosophy department to learn how to debate as a trial lawyer. That's a pre-law thing, They desperately want to get into having some realistic contribution to science.
Yeah.
So then therefore they want to be the most avid upholders of scientific exceptionalism.
Yeah.
And we can join them. Buddhists will join them there. But they don't want to be joined. They're like religious fanatics. They don't want your religion to be the same as their religion because they want theirs to be uniquely the only one.
That's beautifully said, Bob, because fantastic. Because then what happens is a very subtle, very insidious near enemy is then even rationality itself becomes an ideology.
And it's actually the Chittamatra. I prefer to call it Vijnanavada than Yogacara, although people do call it that. Yogacara means a yoga career or yoga practice. And both, there's some of the centrist, Madhyamaka, what are called centrist philosophers, they also call their books Yogacara, So I prefer to call the idealist version of Buddhism, of Mahayana Buddhism, mind only or consciousness only, Vijnanavada, the advocacy of consciousness. And that basically is parallel and opposite to materialism. It's sort of mentalism. It's trying to reduce everything to the mind. And it actually, nobody ever, and people act like it's very philosophical and technical and scientific. And it's particularly wonderful in its epistemology about the way language works in controlling perception. The great Vijnanavada philosophers were fabulous about that, about logic, epistemology, how words form our experiences and things. They really were good about that. And but from the centrist point of view, what's called the Madhyamaka, and by that I don't mean what one of my students once said years ago in a class. They said, "What was that? The Buddhists have an ancient Jewish sect called the Madhyamakas?" Never mind. So don't worry about it. But the Madhyamaka just means centrist, really. It's a middle way, but then nobody wants to use the word middleist because it sounds so barbaric. But centrist we have, and Madhyama also means center, so the central way. And central way is where mind and matter are recognized as mutually interdependent at either a coarse, a subtle, or super subtle level. And so in a way, if you take it all the way to mind, then it doesn't really matter. Mind doesn't mean anything anymore when it's not opposite of matter. Just like when you take it all the way to matter, it doesn't mean anything when there's no mind. You know what I mean? Where there's only nothing and matter. It becomes meaningless and it becomes a trap. But the great thing about the Alaya Vijnana idea, which is very prevalent, as I said, in East Asian Buddhism particularly, Chinese, and it really had a huge sway in China and Japan and Korea and Vietnam. And what is great about it is it gives your seeker of enlightenment the courage to undertake the Bodhisattva path, because if you think of the universe as mainly mind, then it doesn't seem so impossible that by transforming your mind, you can transform this more subtle material, which is the universe. You follow me? If it's a mind field, whereas if the universe also has its material side, it seems more daunting. Which those young yuppies, when they asked Buddha, how can we fix the world? We want to be bodhisattvas and love everybody and be kind and be wise, but we don't know how to fix the whole world. It seems such a huge, daunting job. And then he helped them by saying, it's a mind field of being. But mind is always embodied in this sort of centrist view, But yet it has that thing. I think it's there's two lineages behind the Buddha in Tibetan Buddhism. There's more than that, but there are two main ones. And one is called the profound view lineage, which is the centrist with Madhyamakas, the people, the centrist, like Arjuna and Manjushri and so on. And then there's called the magnificent deeds lineage. And the magnificent deeds lineage is sort of the Bodhisattva path, love and compassion, making the Buddha-verse and transforming. And that one, the magnificent deeds one, kind of more emphasizes the mentalistic nature of the world. So that's the real blessing of the Alaya Vijnana teaching. Even though, if it becomes dogmatic again that there's no matter, then it's again not good. And what is great, by the way, you mentioned something about, when we mentioned about realism, there was something I wanted to add there. And this is something I really appreciate about the Buddha. Buddha is smiling that morning, right? And he starts teaching right away, all kinds of people. And he's so happy, he's all blissed out. And he says, wow, I know everything. Sarvajna, in Sanskrit, that means Tamte Kyamba, in Tibet, that means I know everything. I just know everything. And it's totally great. I'm so happy. Unfortunately, I'm so sorry. I can't really describe it to you. It says, but you can also understand it.
Right.
And what I can do is I can help you with methods of how to accelerate your effort to understand it. I can encourage you that you can, but the reason I can't describe it to you is because anyway, it's beyond normal linear dualistic verbiage. Do you know what I mean? It's so astonishing. It's like a miracle beyond any kind of dogmatic formulation. So while it's total realism, like the good part of science, modern science, it privileges experience over theory.
Right.
So that even the bardo theories are incredibly useful and powerful, but they're not absolute dogmas. Somebody might have experienced it all a little differently. These are considered tried and true over thousands of years, really, really useful. But, that's not the final thing. It has to be exactly 7 days, exactly this and exactly that. So you feel free to improvise.
Right.
Is the idea. You learn it as a scheme. It's like, you can learn all kinds of things about dynamics, about your surfboard, about how to wax it, how to look for waves and do things. And then finally you have to get out there and surf the wave,
Yeah.
and splat yourself down and fall down lots of times. And then finally you let yourself go with the water. And it will be beyond any kind of theoretical thing. But if you don't know how, if you get your board is too short, too long, you don't take advantage of what people have learned in previous experience, then you're making it unnecessarily hard for yourself. Okay, you want to tackle that, Andrew?
Sure. Yeah, and again, this will be interesting to ping a little bit about Bob because, the Kagyu Nyingma version of this may be a little bit interesting in terms of the Gelugpa rendition. But here's my understanding, and I'll test it against yours, and we'll see where this goes. Yeah, this is a Yogacara teaching, a tenet. It's very interesting to me. Alaya as in Himalaya, right? Range.
Yes, Himalaya, right.
And what's
storehouse of snow, that is.
Yes, exactly. And so jnana, wisdom. Vijnana, the prefix is VI is to bifurcate, fracture, or divide. So Alaya Vijnana, virtually synonymous with eighth consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
is in fact a very interesting etymology, basically fracture divided wisdom. And so the Alaya Vijnana, as I understand it, is the basis of the relative samsaric world. Alaya Jnana is the basis of it all. And so when we die, and our mutual friend Alan Wallace talks about Alaya Vijnana, storehouse consciousness, as a kind of stem cell consciousness. It's actually pre-human even. And it is kind of the matrix that, using this particular schema, that in fact we return to at the end of the Eightfold Dissolution. And this is an interesting segue, because this is what Bob and I are going to be talking about a lot. What actually constitutes the Eightfold Dissolution into the Alaya Vijnana and then into the Alaya Jnana / clear light mind. And so according to the Yogacara teachings, which are not accepted by all schools, the Alaya Vijnana is what therefore continues, but it's not an it. It's in order to really understand this, and this is what we will also be talking about, one quite literally has to change the way one thinks. We think in terms of things. We think. And so when we talk about things like the Alaya Vijnana that we return to, that then continues and reincarnates as this kind of stem cell mind, that's not such a simple, easy thing to completely tease apart, because it actually it requires a change in the way we think, what's called epistemology. But fundamentally, it's pre-human. You could very carefully, with as many quotations as you can put on either side, and Bob, I'd love to hear what you say about this. This is probably as close as the Buddhist tradition would come to the 4-letter word soul. But of course, it's not a soul, because it's not an it. It's just a kind of predisposition or repository of latent tendencies. So that's my salvo.
Okay, that's a good salvo. That's perfectly good.
Yeah, and I think this is a good place to throw into the mix, Bob, that what we'll be doing during this week is working through the 3 prajnas, the 3 wisdom tools: ingest, digest, metabolize, hearing, contemplating, meditating, where in fact what you're saying is really the ultimate point is experience really supersedes. It's where everything fundamentally comes into the full literal embodiment, incorporation.
Yeah.
I'll be doing the morning sessions. We'll have 2 sessions, 3 hours in the morning, and then 3 hours in the afternoon. I will be taking the morning sessions. Bob requested if he could do the afternoon, kind of information didactic part. The meditations and the contemplations really, I think, are the most important. And so I will be guiding you through a series of practices, some of which you may already be doing, but maybe bring a new lens to these practices and show you a way to basically die before you die, to be introduced to practices that are extraordinarily effective in terms of preparing us for this final transition. We'll also be working with contemplation practice. I'll send you some guidelines along those lines, something I wrote up that I sent and got some great feedback from Bob about. And then we'll be engaging in some formal active contemplations that are also very supportive of these teachings. And so again, we'll be working through this standard, very classic, elegant, educational, pedagogical approach: hearing, contemplating, meditating, ingest, digest, metabolize. And I'll say more about that tomorrow, because this is a particularly important set of kind of metabolic practices, so to speak, that are really helpful in the bardos, where the teachings literally almost become you, and can be of tremendous benefit not only to yourself but to those around you. One of the great beauties of these wisdom traditions is their sophistication and refinement of terms that we use somewhat colloquially. So when, for instance, you use the word mind, people in this business would say, are you talking about sem, lo, rigpa, yeshe? There are all these gradations of mind. So the first thing that comes, well, maybe I can just send it back in your court. When you say mind stream, are you referring to santana, to sem, to lo? Do you have a sense of what you're meaning by that? And if not, I can give you just a generic response.
Right. I obviously don't. I'm not sophisticated enough to use it more than just colloquially.
Yeah, no, that's cool. That's all good. So with that said, then yes, you could say it's mind stream. And this is it's a nice way to talk about something that fundamentally really cannot even be articulated within the realm of language. This is a little bit what Bob was alluding to earlier. To really understand these bardo tenets, to understand reality, to understand what is it that continues, it's not such a simple thing. It's not an it, and so stream is a little bit more in the direction, finger pointing towards the moon. And so, yes, in the briefest sense, when you're talking about Alaya Vijnana, it's the samsaric mind stream. It's still within the domain of samsara. This is the bed of samsara. Below that is the indestructible continuum, the gyu that Dr. Thurman was talking about. That's the indestructible continuum of the nature of mind itself, which is Rigpa. That's even more foundational than Alaya Vijnana. So Alaya Vijnana is the stream of samsaric propensities, the storehouse consciousness, the repository of these bijas or karmic seeds that continues. It's not an it, it's just a series of kind of momentum, push, movement, wind. And then below that, as that collapses, even that arises from this completely ineffable, indescribable continuum that is, interestingly enough, this tradition probably has 100 names for that. Buddha nature, Tathagata Garbha, Dharmata, Dharmakaya, you name it. And so maybe I'll leave it at that because, as you can see, it starts to get a little bit deep the farther down this rabbit hole you go. So Lung, Chi, Prana, at this level, it becomes almost the correlate to body. So when we talk about things like the indestructible bindu, the indestructible continuum, the body, so to speak, that supports that is a type of lung. And so again, lung is kind of space and motion, it's mind and motion. And so there is an intimation of that. That's a different vocabulary. That's kind of inner yogic vocabulary when you're working with these types of terms, but there are correlates between wind and what we're talking about here for sure. There are what are referred to in kind of a different framework, what are called deep structures and surface structures. And so as we go down this kind of chipper, pardon the gallows humor, when we die, we go through this chipper of the dissolution of the 8 stages of mind, 8 stages of consciousness. And the most superficial levels are all highly indoctrinated and culturated. And the farther down you go, in a certain sense, the more those adventitious or superficial surface structures dissolve, and the more you enter this kind of commonality, somewhat akin to what Carl Jung referred to as the collective unconscious, but obviously even deeper than that. This is kind of the collective super consciousness. And that kind of bed of mind, we all share that, not just with the human species, but with all sentient forms. But this is something that's only experienced ever so briefly, especially with an untrained mind. It's not experienced at all. Or I should take that back. It's experienced, but it's not recognized. And so for the untrained mind, when one collapses into that dimension, literally in the Bardo teachings called the luminous bardo of Dharmata, luminous bardo of reality, luminosity and emptiness, formless dimensions, there is this kind of universality, catholicity of mind that is revealed. But the minute that you kind of move from that, leave from that, then the journey becomes different. And so a Christian, very unlikely that they would experience the archetypes of the deities as the Tibetans articulated. And this is why Bob was talking about it in his translation. There are many ways to work with the experiences that arise at that level. So it's a yes and no. On one level, yes, there is a commonality at the very deepest, most formless dimensions of mind, where every level of form and structure dissolves. But then almost immediately when one arises from that and moves from that, and that's what happens with the untamed, untrained mind, that's in fact the transition from the luminous bardo of Dharmata into the karmic bardo becoming. Then the experience becomes more personal, idiosyncratic, and your propensities then kind of kick back into gear, hence karmic bardo of becoming, and then it's different. But the fundamental archetypal principle is the same. And so some scholars talk about this, and I'll just say this without too much explanation, but this is somewhat important. They talk about the extraordinary mapping that the bardo literature puts out as a type of ritualized phenomenology that may seem like a mouth load, but what it basically means is that there's a near enemy to the articulate process described by these traditions, where we can get kind of lost in the map. And so maybe that's enough for that, yes, most people, what they recognize as their bardo experience is definitely going to be colored by their personal histories, by their collective histories, by their cultures and the like. So we're not all going to have the same type of journey once the journey starts to move, so to speak. So there are certain agents like alcohol that do, they're REM suppressors, but there are other agents as well, certain medications, psychiatric meds and the like, that have a biochemical effect on the brain that can make lucid dreaming a little bit more challenging. But it doesn't exclude you from the practice of lucid dreaming. You can still gain success because, and this is quite important, because first of all, we have to make a little bit of a difference between lucid dreaming and dream yoga. Dream yoga is a larger embrace. And within that larger embrace, there are actually four, and if you look at it in an even wider lens, five practices that constitute what I refer to as these nocturnal meditations, of which lucid dreaming is just one. And so this is a really big topic, and so I'm just going to maybe send a few things out and see what Bob has to say. But for instance, if you're not able to have recollection of dreams, and lucid dreams per se are a little bit challenging, you can engage in a really powerful practice of what's called liminal dreaming, which is kind of that pre and post sleep state. What Pema Chodron talks about is a plasma of the mind, where the mind is basically literally transforming from waking consciousness to dream or sleep consciousness. And this liminal state, threshold state, is a completely viable way to work with lucidity principles. So one thing to say here is, don't limit your lucid dreaming to just lucid dreaming. Raise your gaze, embrace things like liminal dreaming, all these other kind of states that aren't necessarily shrink wrapped into lucid dreaming proper, and understand that lucidity altogether is a code word for awareness. So the fundamental point here is to work with one's awareness, fundamentally, as Bob was alluding to earlier, under all circumstances. And this is the great contribution of the Tibetan kind of armamentarium of skill sets, is literally there are meditations for every bardo, for every state of consciousness. And so this is maybe I'll send this Bob's way. There's so much to say here, but my first intuition is, don't give up. This is Holiness the Dalai Lama says of anything of value, never give up. And just realize that there are different bandwidths of the nocturnal mind that aren't necessarily lucid dreaming per se, that you can still absolutely positively work with. So Bob, I'm curious if you have anything else to say along these lines.
Well, I thought what you said is quite wonderful, and what popped in my mind listening to Judith's thing, and believe me, when I travel, for example, and get jet lagged and this and that, I love zolpidem tartrate. I think it's a great thing. But the other thing is, if you have that and you can get to sleep with it, you can start experimenting. You can do some retreats sometimes, like this retreat that you're doing here, and you've got that to go to sleep with, and then you can kick yourself up and start exploring like what you might think about while staying up a little bit. And instead of, you're tired, but then while you are tired, sort of think about whether you can drift into a kind of semi-sleep state and let your fantasies go, etc. Because when you feel really it's too late and you have to get up in the morning, then you can go and you can knock yourself out with with the Zolpidem or whatever it is that you use. Or they have also John's wort and all kinds of other so-called natural thing. But so I would encourage you, and I think you already encouraged, or you wouldn't be here. You want to sort of begin to notice how to modulate your consciousness, and I think that's really fun. And I'm also, I have to say, after reading Michael Pollan's book, what's it called? How to Control Your Mind?
How to change your mind, yeah.
How to change your mind. I think the resurgence of good psychedelic therapists, psilocybin therapists, all kinds of other therapists, I think that's a really great thing for people who have long-term problems, that they can go back and find out why they felt. I also had a little problem when I was a child. I was worried about what was outside of the bed, and therefore I had a lion that lived under my bed. I didn't actually have a dog because we lived in an apartment in New York City, but I had a lion under there. And then I would, sometimes when I would wake up or something at night, I would go out and ask a parent and say that I needed milk and cookies for Richard. I called the lion Richard. I don't know why.
Lion-hearted.
Maybe. And I would say, Richard. I would say, Richard wants a cookie. And Richard wants some milk, warm milk. And sometimes I would get it, sometimes not, when Richard would get it. So I had that a little bit too, And I have found, and I have many, many testimonials from all over the world, that from people who are Christians or secularists or all kinds of people, not from necessarily only from Buddhists, and that they found great solace in using the Book of the Dead that I did, because I try to make it useful for people who are not necessarily Buddhists. I say put Jesus in here, Mary, some angels, Moses, whoever, Rabbi Hillel, whoever you want, Krishna. In other words, it don't have to be this and that exact Buddha, at this and that day. But the point is, read it as if the person who passed is there listening. And probably they are in those few months, in a month or so, month and a half or so after death. And maybe very first day is not so much because they're kind of spaced out. But then they're going to be there, and they go back to the people they knew and they loved and who loved them, and they go to their own funerals. And then it's important to tell them, no, you can't get back in your body. Don't try. And also, I love certain things that they say. Don't be mad at the priest in the funeral if he's having if he's only thinking about dinner and he's mumbo-jumboing without putting his mind into it. And don't be annoyed if Uncle Joe is having negative thoughts about you, although he's saying nice things. But you can read his, because you might be able to read his mind in your sort of little bit ghost-like bardo being. And you kind of wonder what's happening. So that's a great gift of the Book of Natural Liberation, or so-called Book of the Dead, is realizing that at the time of death, especially of a very dearly beloved person, where you might be really upset, and you normally would be, but the main person who could be getting upset is the one who's traveling in the between. It's not like they just don't exist anymore. They are under a most challenging transition, unless they're already highly prepared to navigate that transition. And so sending your best vibe with them, being as cheered up as you can, sharing with them all positive images of where they can go, and not to be afraid of this or that if they happen to have like a couple of, see some negative things, and look for the angelic beings to help them and all this. In other words, and then bracket that, and a month or two later you can moan and groan and be very unhappy yourself, without fear that unhappiness will disturb the one who departed and make them feel sad that they have departed and they abandoned you or something like that. And we do have an aspect of someone we really love. There's a subliminal aspect in our psychology, I'm encouraged to note from what I've studied and my colleagues who are professionals, that we get a little sense of anger of someone we really depend on, that they've abandoned us. And so sometimes the high demonstrative level in some cultures about freaking out about someone passing away can also partly be not helpful, put it that way, to either you or the person who's departing. So that's I think an important lesson that the Book of the Dead does. And I had so many people say, well, I felt kind of weird. I took a picture of my beloved and put it in front of me. And then I took out that book and then I read some passages. Now you can watch this. Now don't be afraid of that, et cetera, et cetera. Look at this. And then I even phrased it in things they might expect. Maybe they don't know who Buddha Vairochana is or all this kind of thing. Especially some of the divine forms are a bit strange to people who have not had familiarity with the Tibetan thing. So to transpose it into their own culture, I think that will be very helpful to you. Okay? I hope that's okay. Lots of love, everyone. Okay? All the best. Thank you, Andrew.
The Bob Thurman podcast is brought to you in part through the generous support of the Tibet House US Menla membership community and listeners like you, and is released under a Creative Commons No Derivatives license. Please be sure to share, like, and post on your favorite social media platforms. Tashi Delek, and thanks for tuning in.